With Commission for Gender Equality Chief Executive Officer Phelisa Nkomo. Thank you very much, Phelisa, for joining us this evening. Now, in April last year, you reported that young black women have an unemployment rate that is 4.2% higher than the national average. In the fourth quarter figures for 2022, we've just seen the official unemployment rate decreasing by 0.2%. But has the picture changed at all for young black women, given that alarming increase in their rate of unemployment?
Thank you very much for hosting me this evening. Absolutely, the picture hasn't really changed. Let's just, for instance, look at what are the drivers of these sectors, right? Firstly, it's finance sector, which actually require highly technical skills. The second one, it's agricultural sector, of which you hardly find young women in that sector. The other one is trade, which is probably driven by commodities sector. And then you have social services, who are actually drivers of the economy. So those are really the three main sectors that are actually driving the economy. So that's the first issue. I think the second issue is that, South Africans, but also including government, we should not celebrate when we've just seen 0.2%, particularly when we've seen protracted unemployment over the years. If, for instance, we were talking about an experience of unemployment during COVID period, we would have said, you know what, this 0.2% is signaling that the economy is starting to pick up, and therefore it means that the sectors that have really been struggling, they're really starting to unlock what we'd call global supply chain issues that we've been experiencing. There's something positive, though, around the agriculture, which I must say, which we've not been experiencing. And I'd be keen to hear agricultural economists that there's a possibility that, firstly, because there's been a negative impact of Ukraine-Russia war towards the agricultural sector. So there's possibility that, firstly, there's been an easing pressure from that front, but also is that from the agricultural sector perspective, is that the production is on the increase, particularly to look after domestic interest. But of course, the biggest issue for us as a gender commission is just the gendered nature of unemployment. So if you look at the data, for instance, it's actually been quite consistent that it's just above 35%. In fact, now I can see that it's actually just slightly reduced by 39%. And I think we must think about, when we analyze the unemployment statistics, we must think about why women continue to experience exclusion in terms of participation in labor market. And there are several things, though. I think the first one is that women are actually confronted with the notion of social norms that actually exclude women to participate in labor market. The second component is the fact that women are actually participating in the informal sector that is not supported. For instance, one of the reports, by the way, which I really like, by World Bank recently, has actually made very strong argument in the need to support informal sector, self-employment, and as well as entrepreneurship in South Africa, because it's demonstrating signs that actually, if it's supported very well, it could actually grow. And I know that the focus has always been about wanting to support established businesses. One of the key things we've not even asked the question as women of this country, including women who are in the business, what had happened to the 500 billion that the president had allocated during COVID? Because in essence, for instance, amongst the other issue that we should really be looking at, it's how that money was spent, whether entrepreneurs were actually supported from the 200 billion that was actually being handled by the private sector, and even in the 200 billion, whether we've seen women-owned businesses actually got support. So there are a plethora of questions that we must be asking when we're looking at this data. But what it also does is that it actually calls for us to strengthen our advocacy on a number of things. I think the first one is around, we must call for an increased support in terms of reproductive resources for women. That's the first issue. I think the second one is actually for women, that whenever they have access to job opportunities is that they don't only earn decent salaries, but in fact that employers are actually meeting the living wage, and to which was agreed upon and signed off by the president in less than 10 months ago. And I think the other issue is really making sure that we recognize the unpaid social reproductive work, which is the care economy. So if you think, for instance, about women who are working in the early childhood development centers, the amount of money they get to earn, but also as well as the fact that there is no social security for those women, both in terms of pension, but even sometimes unemployment insurance fund. And so in essence, that's something we need to look at. But also we must really make it call for the employers in the care economic sector to meet the living wage that has been agreed upon.
Phelisa, I'm glad you bring that up, and I do apologize for interrupting you, but I want to talk about the increases we've seen in employment within private households, because this has been a trend over the last couple of years that one of the biggest sectors to show increases in employment figures is in private households. Yet that's one of the sectors where we see very little of that job support in terms of long-term planning, pensions, support in terms of minimum wage. But it tells us that the former labour absorption sectors, which traditionally contribute considerably to GDP, are simply not driving job creation if private households continue to be one of the main drivers of employment, especially for women. So what does that tell you, and what is concerning about that picture for the future?
That's actually a very good question. There are several issues, and I think you can't divorce the issues around, supply chain issues globally that we've been experiencing as the, global economy. That's the first issue. And that's actually linked because our economy is actually integrated with the global economy. So in essence, whatever happens in the world, we get to experience as a country. But now, the interesting thing, though, why we're seeing an increase in terms of private households for women, which is those are domestic services, it means that I think people are starting to leave their homes and actually getting out to work. And the interesting thing, and I think it's good you're making the point that, and this is the sector that actually hardly gets support. And I do think that that's something that really government needs to look at. At some point, one of the human rights organization, Black Sash, had called for, domestic services to be classified actually to receive, well, first to be classified as a critical skill, because in essence, for all of us to be able to come to work now, in fact, you're sitting a student now, and you probably needed to have some form of support. So there's someone who gets to do the unpaid social reproductive work. And in fact, I think the point you're asking is that it actually centers so well the issues around the need to make it sure that when you undertake either your economic policies and industrial development policies, you actually really need to center them around women, because what that indicates is that already now women are starting to support families to go back and participate in labor market. Something else that we've really been asking, and I think it would be we should actually watch in the next quarter, is to really see whether government is actually responding to what we call gender responsive procurement. And part of the gender responsive procurement is to really make it sure that it builds in, women, LGBTI plus, but as well as young women, to make it sure that they have access to opportunities within the public sector. And one of the things that would be quite interesting would also be see that while the private households seem to be contributing to employment, which sectors are most of these households coming from? And I mean, one of the things, though, I take off my head for is that States SA is actually the data disaggregated approach they're applying for us to see who's getting opportunity to employment and who is not. But I think we need to even dig a little bit deeper to begin to actually understand exactly when we talk about the private households, how are those private households participating in different in several sectors, because there is a link between where private households are participating in the economy versus the sectors that are actually driving the economy, which in this context will only treat agriculture, it's trade, but as well as it's a finance sector. So it means that, again, when you think about unemployment issues, that most of these sectors require technical expertise. And if you look at the Stats SA report, they raise the issue that access to education or attainment of good technical skills is actually could be facilitate mobility to access better position. But if women don't have access to good technical skills, it could actually be a serious inhibitor, which from the data we're seeing is that a lot of women don't have access to good education. So in essence, hence I'm saying that what this data, unemployment data triggers, it triggers a plethora of things, which is amongst those is we really need to call for access to equitable education, which in fact, as Commission for Gender Equality, it's something that that's on our radar, because it facilitates for women not only to live decent lives and that they can actually contribute in the economy, but also they can live productive lives without having to rely on social security as a safety net.
Well, thank you very much for your insights this evening. That's the Commission for Gender Equality Chief Executive Officer Phelisa Nkomo talking to us after the release of the fourth quarter statistics in terms of unemployment, where we did see that 0.2% decrease in the official unemployment number.